But we're not talking about a slight downward revision. We're talking about huge downward revision. You think that's just done? You think we're just going to sweep that one under the rug and move on? Of course not. Of course not. I mean, there is no, I don't care how bullish you are, there is no way that you can dispute the fact that we have gone from the boom phase in the credit cycle to the bust phase. No, Jim Cramer wouldn't even argue that. Probably takes it up to, I don't know, 10%. Okay, well, Mike Green's bogey is 5.5, 6. So you take the unemployment rate to 10%. Now, all of a sudden, that passive inflow turns into a passive outflow. And that means instead of the market, the stock market, the S&P 500, being propped up by just people taking 10% of their paycheck every single month and distributing that and taking that straight into their index fund, now all of a sudden, that 10% a month, instead of going in, it's coming out. It's coming out. Hello, fellow Rebel Capitals. Hope you're well. So we have the new GDP numbers out, or at least the revisions. And the GDP revisions are starting to look a lot like the non-farm payroll revisions. I think you guys know exactly what I'm referring to. But we're not talking about a slight downward revision. We're talking about huge downward revisions. So let's dive into the details, see what's happening, and then also try to connect the dots with the labor market, because that is so important. And then also AI. I think that's a big, big component of what we're seeing and what we will see throughout the rest of 2026. Okay, who knows where Josh is? You guys can decide. Is he swiping on Tinder or is he swiping on Grindr? I don't know. You guys let me know what you think in the comments. But the bottom line is he is MIA. So I'm going to do my own screen share. And let's go over to, where do we want to start? Well, let's start right from the horse's mouth, the BEA. In fact, let me zoom in for you guys so you can see this. Let me make sure the screen share is actually working. Yes, it is. Okay. Oh, view, zoom in. There we go. All right. So the GDP, this is the second estimate. So this is basically the first revision, if you want to look at it that way, fourth quarter 2025. Now, remember, the headline number that we got back then was a 1.4, but they came in today and they downwardly revised that to, drum roll please, 0.7. 0.7, half of what they told us the GDP growth was before. Now, for those of you who watch this channel all the time, you know what I've been saying for the last 6 months, maybe even longer than that. I've been saying this so I'm blue in the face. I say, look, you've got these two main indicators. You've got the labor market and you have real GDP. And they're going in the complete opposite directions. So they can't both be true. We can't have GDP skyrocketing and running on all 8 cylinders and the economy in fuego, while we have the non-farm payrolls and the labor market completely collapsing. And oh, by the way, if you were living under a rock and you didn't hear, the last non-farm payroll print that we got before revisions was a negative 92,000. And I've been saying, I said, this dog don't hunt. So one of these things has to change. Either the labor market has to rapidly do a 180 and accelerate to reflect what we're seeing in the GDP numbers, or the GDP numbers have to start tanking and get downwardly revised, very similar to what we saw in 2008, to go ahead and reflect what we are seeing in the labor market. And my base case was you would see GDP start to come down and reflect what we're seeing in the labor market. And that is exactly what is happening. So here you go. Here are the real GDP numbers. And by the way, you know, if you want to look at this, I don't know how many more revisions they do, but however many they do, they'll probably be downwardly revised again and again and again. very similar to what we saw during the GFC. So what contributed to this new number? So we see that consumer spending was downwardly revised, investment downwardly revised, government spending was an actual negative, or that's actually a positive, though. You know what I'm saying? The government spending contributed to a negative, or how should I say this? The government spending declined, which was a drag on GDP. But over the long run, in my view, and I think your view too, it's definitely a net positive. That's what I'm trying to say. So they thought that the negative drag was, I don't know, call it 0.9 when it turned out to be, looks like right around 1%. Now, if you think that tariffs are just making the economy boom and we're going into this manufacturing renaissance, I would point out that exports were worse than they thought, and imports are worse than they thought as well. So pretty much any way you slice it, dice it, the economy was a lot weaker than they led you to believe with the headline number. Again, very similar to what we're seeing with the non-farm payrolls. So here you go. They say current dollar GDP. That nominal GDP? I'm assuming that's what they're referring to. So they revised nominal from 5.1 down to 4.5. And for the PCE, actually, let's go over to the calendar. So PCE, we're ahead of ourselves here. It is the 13th. Oh, they already switched it up on me. Okay, here you go. So the personal consumption expenditures, which is what the Fed really likes to pay attention to, that the delayed report came in line with expectations. The year over year, a little low. The core in line year over year and monthly. Look at durable goods orders. The expectation was for 1.3%. That came in at goose egg. Now, what was interesting is the job openings, a lot higher than you would expect, especially with the negative non-farm payrolls. But again, you got to ask the question, do you think that the JOLTS numbers are right or the non-farm payrolls? I would say are a better reflection of the labor market, and I would say the non-farm payrolls are a better reflection, also at ADP, than the JOLTS numbers. I mean, probably the reason you're seeing the job openings go up is because people are just desperate to find anyone that knows how to use AI. More on that in just a moment here. Consumer sentiment low, as you would expect. All right, now to add insult to injury, let's go over to this article I just saw on the Wall Street Journal. And remember, in 2008, for those of you who can remember back that far, I know I remember it vividly, Ben Bernanke came out and said that subprime is contained. There's nothing to worry about it. You plebs just go on with your daily business and just keep spending money. There's nothing to see here. There's nothing to see here. Much ado about nothing. And sure enough, there was something to see there, and subprime was not contained. Well, what are we dealing with today, guys? Obviously, it's private credit. They're saying private credit is contained. Private credit is contained. Okay, that's fine. But now we are not only seeing issues with private credit, we are not only seeing issues with the real economy from the standpoint of the labor market, but we're starting to see this rhyme a little too much with 2008. Here's what I'm referring to. There we go. Homeowners are turning to adjustable rate mortgages. Yay! Because that's all we need to have a real perfect storm. Because if we have another GFC or if we have another financial crisis, we don't want it to be just a little one. Hell no. We want to go for the gusto, baby. If we're going to have a GFC, bring it on. Let's just have the category 5 or 10 or whatever the biggest hurricane is. Why would we want just in the United States, we want a Texas size GFC. We don't want that little puny Rhode Island size financial crisis. New. I mean, bring it on. Jeez. Talk about adding insult to injury. When it rains, it pours. So the prospects of short-term savings is pushing more buyers to adjustable rate mortgages. Yeah, because what happens? Now, mortgage rates have been coming down, by the way, and prices in a lot of areas have been coming down as well. But when you have the labor market deteriorating, it doesn't matter. People, like I always say, the interest rates don't control the economy. They're a reflection of the economy. So if you see those mortgage rates coming down, be careful what you wish for, because often that means that demand is going to go down even further, because that's simply a reflection of a deteriorating economy. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing right here, where people just, they don't have the income. So it's not that they want an adjustable rate mortgage, it's that they just don't have a choice and they're turning to that. And we know how that ends, right? And think about that. They're doing this with the unemployment rate at 4.4. What happens if the unemployment rate goes to 5.5, which is actually quite normal? What happens if the unemployment rate goes to a recession level? Call it 8, 9, 10%. Then what's going to happen to aggregate demand? Then what's going to happen to demand for housing? And then what's going to happen to all these people that have an adjustable rate mortgage, even if the rates go down? Okay, fine. If the rate goes down and you lose your job, the fact that you have a low interest rate, that doesn't matter. You still can't make the mortgage payment, right? And by the way, let's not forget, maintenance costs going up, insurance going up, the property taxes are going up as well. So this is something that I think plays into the what we're seeing in the labor market. This is a derivative of what we're seeing in the labor market, and the GDP is a derivative of what we're seeing with these negative non-farm payroll numbers, which, by the way, I think out of the last 9 months, 5 months have been downwardly revised to the point where we have negative non-farm payrolls. Now, what I challenge you guys to do is look at a chart of non-farm payrolls and go back to I don't care when you go back to the 1970s and try to find a time when we had 5 months out of 9 months, a 9-month period with negative non-farm payroll where we weren't in a recession or we didn't have an economic contraction, whatever you want to call it. It's going to be tough to find, meaning it doesn't exist. You can find times when we have like a one-off due to a weather event or a big strike or something like that, but then it just, boom, rebounds. To have basically a 9-month period where over 50% of the reports show a negative number, you can't find that outside of a recession. And I know a lot of people push back, say, oh, George, you're just fear-mongering. This is fake news because we just sent all the Venezuelans back across the border, or the Mexicans, or we had all this illegal immigration. Now they're not working, so that's showing up in the jobs data. Let's just assume that's true. The bottom line is those jobs aren't being filled. Therefore, that aggregate demand isn't being filled, and therefore you would expect GDP to still take a hit. All right, now let's go over. Let's go to CNBC, because we've got to think about GDP through the lens of the labor market. And when you consider what's happening in the labor market, you have to consider AI. You absolutely, unequivocally have to consider AI. And by the way, you guys know from watching my videos how dependent the U.S. economy is on asset prices. And one of those assets is the S&P 500, which you guys know is propped up by passive investing, the passive bid. You guys know how that works. You've listened to my friend Mike Green many, many times explain this. And I had a lunch with Mike Green where I sat with him for 2 or 3 hours. And we were talking about where the unemployment rate would need to be, regardless of why it gets there, regardless of whether it's because of immigration or it's because of AI or it's because of the stuff hitting the fan. Regardless, I said, based on your models, where does the unemployment rate need to be in order for the passive flows to go from net inflow to net outflow? And Mike said right around 5.5%. So just to be conservative, let's say 6%. So then you look at this article that shows AI agents could easily send college grad unemployment over 30%. Now, I don't think this is hyperbole, especially if you've been watching what's happening with OpenClaw, which is, if you guys haven't been paying attention, this is this new AI agent, open source AI agent, that basically does everything for you. It's like anything that your assistant would do online, it does it for you. So if you want to book reservations, if you want to, I mean, check out a YouTube video of how this actually works. And it's incredible. And you sit there and ask yourself, well, all these college grads, when they come into corporate America, what are they doing? Well, they're usually just doing stuff on a computer that now an AI agent can do easily for free. And you don't have to pay them benefits. They don't complain. You don't have to babysit them. You don't have to deal with drama with their girlfriends breaking up with them or whatever it is. So where is it now? That's the question that we need to ask, because we all know that the labor market is very weak for college grads, like alarmingly weak right now. But currently, or at the end of 2025, you guys can see this, we're about 5.7%. Now, the underemployment rate is 42.5%. That's the highest level since 2020. I mean, that in and of itself is a mind-blowing number. But think about 5.7% going to 30%. What does that do to the unemployment? Let's say all else being equal. What does that do to the unemployment rate? Probably takes it up to, I don't know, 10%. Okay, well, Mike Green's bogey is 5.5, 6. So you take the unemployment rate to 10%. Now, all of a sudden, that passive inflow turns into a passive outflow. And that means instead of the market, the stock market, the S&P 500, being propped up by just people taking 10% of their paycheck every single month and distributing that and taking that straight into their index fund, now all of a sudden, that 10% a month, instead of going in, it's coming out. It's coming out on net. And it is very hard, almost impossible for me to see a situation or a scenario where you have the passive bid go negative and the S&P 500 still goes up. So then you have to ask the question, okay, well, if that actually plays out and the economy is so dependent upon asset prices, well, then what happens to GDP? And then what happens to the labor market? You see how we go into this doom loop, right? Where the S&P goes down, that impacts the economy negatively, that impacts the labor market, and that makes the S&P 500 go down even more. And it just goes round and around. It's like a death spiral almost. And by the way, I haven't even mentioned private credit. I've mentioned it, but you throw private credit in a credit cycle, credit crisis, whatever you want to call it. I mean, there is no, I don't care how bullish you are, there is no way that you can dispute the fact that we have gone from the boom phase in the credit cycle to the bust phase. No, Jim Cramer wouldn't even argue that. So you just throw that into the mix. And then, oh, by the way, you throw oil prices going north of 100, you throw that one in the mix and ask yourself, what does that do to aggregate demand? Well, we don't have to guess. We have an answer. Just go back to 2008. Remember what happened to oil prices? Went up to 140. What did that do to aggregate demand? That was in the summer of 2008. Well, we all know how that movie ended. And it did not end well. And it did not end, by the way, with inflation. It ended with disinflation and in Q2 or Q3 of 2009, outright deflation. So this is what we're dealing with right now. And I think, unfortunately, the worst is yet to come. I don't see, I mean, it's anything's possible, but you have to ask yourself, what are the probabilities? So as an example, with this credit cycle, what are the probabilities that all of these cockroaches are coming to the surface? The tide is going out. We're seeing who is swimming naked. And by the way, now it's impacted Blackstone, BlackRock, JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, and Morgan Stanley. And those are the ones we know about. In addition to all the little guys like Cliffwater, that just came out yesterday, and Blue Owl. Of course, we've been hearing about that for months. So you think that's just done? You think we're just going to sweep that one under the rug and move on? Of course not. Of course not. We're only in inning 4 or 5 of that game. And I see it getting a lot worse before it gets better. And that's just me being realistic. So you guys let me know what you think in the comments below. All right, guys, there's a lot of news, a lot of stuff going on, a lot of variables, and we are living through some volatile times, to say the least, not just from a macroeconomic standpoint, but obviously a geopolitical standpoint as well. If there is ever a time when you should be thinking about going to Rebel Capitalist Live, it's right now. That's the investment conference I have. You want to check it out, the speaker lineup that we have. It's going to be amazing. We'll put a link in the description below. On that bombshell, guys, enjoy the rest of your day. As always, make sure you are standing up for freedom, liberty, free market capitalism. We'll see you in the next video.
Join the Rebel Capitalist Pro community. Visit rebelcapitalistpro.com.